thanks all for showing up. You know, we win as far as sessions go. I feel a little bad about the other sessions, but not too bad. Dryland systems are obviously a hot topic, and I think there's a lot of good reasons for that. Our first speaker for this afternoon, I don't have my notes, but I know her pretty well, Urszula Norton. Urszula has a master's from Iowa State, which is where we met, and a PhD from Montana, and she's a soil scientist. She's so crazy about soil science that she married one.
So that or made her crazy, one of the two.
You made an conversation?
Our son's a senior in high school, and he doesn't know what he wants to do, but he knows what he doesn't want to do. That's what that is. Okay, well, Ursula's talk is she's gonna talk a lot about a 5-year study we've been doing where we have applied large amounts of compost as one-time treatments, which Jim touched on, and work he's doing as well. And we've also incorporated cover crops in the fallow periods in those systems. And so she's going to touch on that and some other work she's got going on.
Don't spoil it for everybody.
Yeah.
Am I spoiling it?
Oh, yeah.
I didn't,
Story of my life.
didn't tell the results. Okay. She's talking about our son again. Okay, Urszula Norton.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane Norton. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming. I'm really surprised that everyone came here when we turned the lights out. I'm sure that we're doing a little bit of a snoozer. It's after lunch sort of a thing, yes? Exactly. What I wanted to follow up is a couple of really interesting talks that we listened to in the Dryland session this morning. Mainly learning a lot or refreshing our whole concept of nitrogen cycling and then the transfer of the nitrogen to different parts of the plant. We also had a really interesting talk provided by Jimmy Polito, who talked a little bit about sort of comparing commercial inorganic fertilizer with biosolids and the potential waste, yet the qualities and ability of the biofertilizer to deliver similar sort of properties to for the sake of the performance of long-term plants and soil parameters and soil health indices were comparable. And so now my husband texted me sort of unexpectedly with putting together a talk about cover crops. And I was partially involved in this process of collecting data on the cover crops, and I've actually, in the process of putting this talk together, I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot, and I sort of given us a completely new level of appreciation of people who are trying to make it happen, and especially in this extremely sort of a marginally productive area. So I would like to acknowledge contributions from both Tina and my two graduate students who are here, and maybe Badu Brempong, who gave a presentation of 2 posters on similar topics last year. She was, by the way, one of the winners of the posters competition. And then obviously Jay. So how did you make it work? Sorry about that. Okay, I'm just going to. All right, so I'm supposed to wing it, I guess.
Click on the window, Jay. Click into the application. There you go. That's
Thank
right.
you.
Is it working?
Yes.
There you go.
Now it works.
Yes.
Who told me that? Ah, okay. I gotta remember you.
So I would like to pose a couple of questions and then sort of have a casual conversation, whether at the beginning or at the end of this talk, about certain things that we may have in mind as we grow cover crops in this area, or we would like to grow, or we quit growing just because of specific parameters. Do you think that, obviously, the cover crops suppress weeds? So let's move along. Reduce the water content.
Yes.
Yes. Anybody says no? Okay, well, that's a good answer. Are they really compromising the successful winter wheat establishment? Okay, reduce winter yields.
So, not necessarily.
I don't know.
That's good. Very good. Are there any potential benefits? that you can-
Increase wheat
So
production,
either increase or decrease water yield,
increase quality.
quality, protein content.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Fertility,
Somebody said
fertility.
fertility. So soil parameters, very good. How much precipitation? If you say yes, how much precipitation do you have in your area? Not enough.
Well, 12 inches.
Oh man, we're on the same boat. What cover crops do you plant? If you have cover crops, what do you plant? What do you use for cover crops? Or what do you use for cover crops?
Beans.
Legumes? Any cereals?
Oats.
Oats? Maybe.
The question isn't what your annual precipitation is, it's how much of it do you save?
Well, yeah.
Because
We'll get to that one
a wheat
too.
fallow cycle uses 50% of the precipitation to evaporation.
Mhm, mhm. Absolutely. All right, well, maybe we can find answers to these questions together. Maybe Alan a lot. Most likely we will learn that today. But we are dealing with, we're going up north. We're going to the Northern Plains. And I presume most of you guys are from this area. We obviously have very sporadic sort of often drought stricken sort of area of anywhere from 11 to 14 inches per year. Most of it we have on the borderline of winter, those wet snowstorms, and the spring. We have variable temperature from super cold to super warm, up to the 90s maybe. Grown degree days is about 125 per street, but I will lower it down a little bit once in a while. Soils, we have silty clays or silts, low nutrient content, nitrogen fertilizer, less than 1% of organic very calcareous and alkaline, we all know that, right? And obviously, we live in a location that was awarded the most beautiful tornado of the year by Washington Post last year, right? So, yeah, those little things come, they maybe destroy our livestock, our farms, or crop or something like that. They don't happen often, but I know that in our neck of winter wheat country, we do have this here, right? So, so the question is, are or will cover crops be effective in the northern high plains? And it's a very open question. We all have to think about it, that this is not an easy task. We plant, we go and harvest later. No, it's a pretty much sort of like growing almost your vegetables year round. Do you guys see any weeds, by the way, here? No. Well, so this is a collection that we planted at Lingo, so 11 inches of precipitation of 4 different cover crops. Cold season nitrogen fixers, the whole mixture of everything from a green cover. Was a cold season soil building, and there was also a mycorrhizal mix. And on the backdrop, you have actually the same strip in the fallow, so you can clearly see how things can look if there's no weeds in here. I personally removed all the weeds by hand. It took me like 4 hours to do that from this collection, and I built completely new appreciation of farmers dealing with weeds in the dryland system. The next day, I called and scheduled emergency carpal tunnel surgery because it was just one of the most fatiguing and most painful sort of experience I've had in my life. So in so many ways, if you think about cover crops, one of the concepts, and I think we've heard this conversation earlier during the Q&A session, they add all the whole level of diversification. We have winter wheat fallow, and then if we could put cover crops, we would diversify. And with this term comes the whole new dimension of additional ecosystem services that go beyond just producing a grain biomass. We can diversify in time, we can diversify in space, right? So, so what we do when it comes to space, we're breaking up, and everyone will have to think for themselves, the continuous fallow, which otherwise would last about 14 months, into like 9 months of a long fallow, maybe something even take. Then we could put cover crops maybe in the spring when there's enough moisture for a short period of time, like a pulse. And we call it perhaps a green fallow. These are the terms I'm coming up with. And then we would finish it off for 3 months with, again, sort of a modified long or modified fallow or bare fallow that in hopes that would be enough rain to accumulate in the soil for winter wheat. And so there's a lot of interesting literature from different parts of the high plains about whether or not we actually compromise winter wheat or not, just because we cannot harvest and accumulate that moisture in the profile because we may have some sort of an interference. But if we're dealing with 11 inches of precipitation, I have not seen enough data yet to really say whether it's effective or not. I mean, it's already so dry, and if these guys are opportunists, maybe they can provide some long-term benefit that would help build the soil structure and eventually soil water, right? So also, if you think about the presence of this green fallow, that short period of time, we're also adding a whole new dimension of rotational complexity. So we're having something or some presence of plants that can exploit the soil in a very effective, smart way, and can actually add more plant biomass. And what I would like to say is grow microbes. Okay, it's important ecosystem engineers. They're doing all this job, even though they're sort of downgraded in the whole health, sort of a soil health index into the smallest bar, as we saw with James DiPolito. But it's sort of like a butterfly effect. You know, it can, they're doing the job without us even realizing because you can see them, right? So we talk about both the complexity on the temporal scale. So we're dealing with anything from the weeks to maybe years, or a spatial scale, when we can think about what happens right there in the level of the rhizosphere. It can extrapolate that sort of specific ecosystem service even into the landscape, okay? So everything comes down to the whole concept and idea of improving the nitrogen and the water use efficiency in the semi-arid systems. Just because the stew experiences a major co-limitation, right? So we either have, we may have a lot of nitrogen, but if we don't have water, nothing flows into the plants, right? So that's really important, how to effectively sort of outsmart a system that would allow us more of a sustained and predictable way of delivering these two together. So again, I think we all talk about cover crops, just not as a green biomass that we planted, but it's a whole series of interacting mechanisms all at work, 24/7, right? So when you think about it, let's start with an individual plant that might be a part of the cover crop or any vegetation or a crop. So we have a plant that is a major sort of a contributor to a variety of organic matter. I'd like to sort of talk about the contributions of plant biomass, whether through the residue, and the residue comes from obviously from about and kilograms. And we have this whole stepwise of processes that builds upon existing microbial sort of properties, soil properties, and so on, into the more of a complex, or maybe recalcitrant, functionally different soil organic matter. We may have a direct sort of a source of mineralized form of nitrogen, phosphorus, into the soil from sort of a different degrees of decomposition of this really new inputs of residue. And we also have this stabilized organic matter that builds on, that we also grow as we grow crops, right? Or as we grow cover crops. And we may have sort of a switch and transition in the function of this organic matter, thinking that these more recalcitrant poles are more structural. They are here to build up a more improved soil water holding capacity, or provide microsites for microbes to mineralize, process something else that is being available through this residue. Okay? So now when you think about it, you're building up on, by adding cover crops, they're in different mixtures, you're adding the complexity of every single unit like this on a larger field scale. So think about it, you have completely different above ground life forms here. If you have, let's say, sunflowers, some cereals, maybe even daikon radishes here, although this looks a little reddish. And then you have completely different architecture of roots that occupy different niches at different times. Okay, they can more likely be more overlapping and complementary rather than competitive if the same sort of root forms were present next to each other. Does it make sense so far? Okay. So, so what I'm going to try to sort of refer to is talking about, it's all about soil supply and crop demand, right? And whether it's the crop demand of a cover crop or a crop demand that would build on the legacy of the cover crop, okay? So we talk about, specifically we'll talk a little bit about sort of the theoretical approaches to gaining soil organic carbon, so water and nitrogen retention and its availability. Then we can talk a little bit about root and rhizosphere processes where all these hotspots are occurring for all the mineralization. And then we can talk a little bit pressures by our usual culprits, right? The wheat pests under a variety of climatic environments that we experience here in Northern Green Plains. So I put a lot of text because my voice is impaired sometimes and I start losing it at the end, so I can just read it out. So generally, it has been shown, and through this meta-analysis of 122 fields by McDonald's in the past, that generally, if you have continuous buildup of more complex rotations with more crops, you may, just by the presence even of a cash crop, by just having this rotation in place, you may actually grow soil organic carbon anywhere from 7.8 to 12.9%, with most likely our system being here is not the outliers, right? So if we have this series of interacting mechanisms that work to understand the whole complexity of cover crops or multiple complex cropping per se, we're dealing with the increase in the total plant residue inputs to the soil by having those cover crops. And we also have increased in very diversified pool of root exudates. And I think it's really important to realize that exudation of living rhizosphere is a really important part of the process of making nutrients available on a regular basis. So more power to roots, right? And they have been shown by Austin et al., a group, a very effective productive group that deals with soil organic carbon, that this rhizosphere exudation is the one that really promotes stabilization of soil organic carbon in the soil. So it sort of moves it or converts it or coats it or interacts with different forms of organic matter or becomes the substrate for subsequent product that stays in the soil. So stabilization, right? So generally, also diversified residues that are coming from all the different background mixtures that we see, they also maintain high organic carbon due to the changes of soil microbial carbon use efficiency. So what it means is that so there's a portion of that organic matter released to the soil, and it's used for microbial growth. So not only everything is stabilized in more of an inert or dead microbial, dead soil organic matter, but microbes themselves are an important tool of immobilizing this organic matter in a very critical times during the plant growth. So microbial biomass is also a really, so growing microbial biomass globally is also a really important a pool that we need to deal with. And generally, what it consequently, obviously, we're stabilizing it and letting that soil organic carbon stay instead of being blown up to the atmosphere as a CO2, right? Yes. So generally, and we talked a little bit about it earlier, similar to biosolids, also the presence of this organic matter being turned over into the soil increases or allows to create organic matter sort of connections or networks that would link together individual grains of soil particles to aggregates and then therefore build a structure. The black soil that Dryland had on his the paper obviously looked much better than that sort of a lighter colored soil. And that's because we had a organic matter sort of binding in and linking it all together. And obviously there's a straight relationship between organic matter, the percent, and then amount of aggregates present in the soil. So more on microbes, and I'm sure I promise only 2 more slides about these beautiful little critters here. But not only we talk about the quantity of soil organic carbon that is built into this sort of a microbial biomass pool, but we're also changing functional diversity of microbes. More diversified the lowland environment it is, the more active they can be because they can have, they can even process and decompose residues. Even under water limited environments, even more poor residue quality substrates. There will be some that are present that otherwise wouldn't be. It would be just a straight winter wheat-fallow. They are there and they are able to do it. So this whole accelerated process of a breakdown or even more recoupling organic matter coming from the residue may happen within a sort of a little injection of chemicals for a short period of time. We also have a lot of microbial enzymes that can be very diversified and therefore capable of bridging out different substrates and processing like in place as well. And Veronica Acosta Martinez spends a lot of work time working at it in Texas. And then for the more labeled carbon that is being processed by microbes, the more active microbial biomass and the greater demand of nitrogen potentially will be released. Okay, so so if we diversify crop rotations, we diversify below ground environment as well. We are assigning a lot of new functions, or we're pretty much attributing a lot of important additional ecological or microbial set of processes into attributing a lot of those services into the microbes. So generally, if you think about it, microbes are sinks. They'll sink it in when the plant roots are either too small or not around to intercept that nitrogen. And think about if you apply fertilizer in the spring and the plants are really, really small and the roots are really, really short, they're not dealing with it when they lose it. Okay, when they lose it to either greenhouse gas emissions or runoff if there's a lot of water, or convert it into something that might not be really available. And the microbes are able to intercept it and keep it for a little time, for a period of time. So so those can be benefits that can be accrued and realized over a longer period of time. So think about it in the slow release fertilizers, and it can be or is already more synchronous with the nitrogen demands of plants. So microbes can release it, and then plants can take it right when it's necessary and it's needed, right? So having more diverse rotations, we have more labeled carbon and a greater microbial nitrogen cycling capacities. Right? Does it make sense so far? Okay. So I'm going to move through it. I think this is like at least a few times that we saw this graph was similar about nitrogen cycling. You guys want to get quiz on that one?
I didn't study.
So we're dealing with nitrogen cycling in a moisture limited environment, right? Generally, it's very moisture controlled. It has to have optimal conditions for a delivery from one pool to another, access of microbial communities to water to use it as a substrate for specific conversions, just to make this process cycle. So what happens with the low moisture content? We have discontinuous kind of relationship between a source or substrate and the product, and then who is carrying this out, right? So that connectivity between water to pore space decreases. So things become more of a unique microsites and maybe hotspots for a moment, but they, then they lose that ability to do it if there's no water. So we have obviously less nitrogen flowing to the plant roots. We have less enzymes, which is organic matter substrates. And then we have very often lower nitrification, which is the process that is commonly occurring in this landscape as soon as the substrate is ready. So what happens is that those diversified rotations that have cover crops can mitigate this negative effect of moisture limitation. And what happens is it's going to make this process more tight. So things are sort of fluctuating on more predictable sort of manners. But I really like this picture. I've shown it 20 times so far.
I think there's a weed right up there. I'm just kidding.
Oh, yeah, this is not my So yes, and I agree, and most of you guys mentioned that cover crops deplete soil water content, and there are a couple of studies I want to share with you. One was from Akron, Colorado, and it's an older study, but it was a very well sort of produced research when they did a multi-year sort of a set of terminating, of setting up or planting in early April a variety of leguminous cover crops, and they would terminate it every 2 weeks, starting in early June, and they, at any instance, the water content in the soil profile was compromised and the wheat yield was compromised. Okay. Another one was from Bozeman, Montana, when in a group of Plain Jones, they planted legume green manures. They called them LGMs, which is kind of like a catchy thing. They planted them in the fall, no luck, nothing survived. And it's a pretty dry sort of area. In the spring, they were able to establish it, and then they pretty much related it not on a calendar basis, determination basis, but by phenological stage of different legumes. So they figured out that they get most credits of nitrogen fixation when they would terminate at a pod stage, so past the flowering. And very often, sometimes flowering would be the cutoff for a lot of crops in different climates. But you notice that some of the cover crops were able to carry on fixation until the pod stage, so accruing more and more nitrogen as a benefit, as a credit. But in low precipitation, it pretty much didn't matter, because if the water got shut off, obviously the microbes were not fixing more nitrogen. So in order to compromise, and then for the sake of actually saving a little bit of water during the drought season, they would actually recommend doing it terminating during the flower, no matter what. Okay. And that was the recommendation they made. I thought it was a very useful study, lots of interesting exploration. Also, if you think about the water use or water storage, you also have to think about water use efficiency. So you may have different crops or different plants with different traits and different ways of getting hold of the water and realizing it in the plant biomass. And this is a picture taken by Tina, her experiment, where under optimum water conditions, the same mixtures of oats and Austrian winter pea had a dominance of Austrian winter pea and about 3-to-1 in terms of the biomass, and then Austrian winter pea barely germinated in the field. So majority of biomass they were getting from the cover crops was oats. In fact, last year there was no Austrian winter pea because something happened to the seed, and if we had like 2 or 3 of those germinate. So we were able to compromise sort of ability to get that extra nitrogen that would come from nitrogen fixers in the field, not in here. Okay. So water is obviously the driver that would sort of create a different stand starting from the same sort of a composition of seed and mixture. We talked about general properties of soil organic matter, and obviously over a period of time we will have a build-up benefit of this biomass being turned into a soil, right? So we'll have more of an infiltration because we have micropores, openings, dead channels created by decaying roots. So we are able to move that water sometimes even into the particular water storage profile. So having also, without, if you leave it, and I don't know how we would sort of kill it, but if you like press it, roll it or something, and if you have a mulch, even live or dead or self-finesse, you may have decreased evaporative water loss as well from the surface, right? And then hence that also wind erosion, which is our middle name in this area, right? Okay. So I'd like to start introducing slowly some of the data of this 4 years of study. And hold on. This is pretty much So we had the first bar shows bare fallow, wheat in the bare fallow. It's sort of average over time soil water content. This is the wheat cover crop fallow and the wheat. This is the cover crop fallow, wheat, and then again cover crop fallow, and then wheat, bare fallow, and wheat. And our concern about water content in Lingo showed that over a period of 4 years, the only place where we were able to notice the differences of water content was between bare fallow and then the other ones. So what happens was that we didn't see any differences in the water content, having the cover crop planted for so many years. But look, we're dealing with 14% at max. I mean, this is like a nice day, right? So again, we're looking for, in this case, not really a positive effect, but no negative effects, right? So what would be a different way of looking at the cover crops as well in terms of how would they acquire nitrogen from the soil? And in this case, this is if you had a chance to see posted about this more in Tina, they have all sorts of data, but I thought I'd show this one as a classical example. So they use N15 and they try to look at the mode of a nitrogen uptake by different crops in the mixture of the cover crops. So it's either in oats or it's in Austrian winter peat from compost. So this is the compost signature. And then this is the soil signature. And this is the oat signature. And they had a control here. And then they've had a soil with the cover crops planted for 3 years. And they had a soil with a very fresh compost amended and planted to oats as well. So the orange ones are showing the different signature, meaning that this specific nitrogen came exactly from the compost. So the higher the value that you see here, the more reliant of the plant nitrogen on the source of nitrogen from compost it was, okay? Now, there's a little blue thing. It says peas. Austrian winter peas, you don't have anything here. I'll try to find this a little later. This is just, I want to be public. There's no presence, obviously, because they are, so there should be nitrogen fixers, right? Is it straightforward so far? So now, when you put the whole concept of having cover crops in those multiple rotations, and you, there was a really good paper from Microbes Climate of the soybeans and then wheat and then corn and adding some cover crops as a part of it, right? And looking at what they call ecosystem services. There was a whole line of those ecosystem services that were analyzed in multiple ways by either modelers, economists, biogeochemists. Yes. And what happened is that out of these 11 parameters showed that cover crops can positively affect just general yields and performance of the ecosystems. And they noticed that the nutrient retention benefits occurred during the cover crop growth. So yes, this is the best time to actually build out those nutrients. The weed suppression benefits, it was interesting. And mind, this is not a water environment, occurred during the cash crop growth through the cover crop legacy. So that smothering or some form of interactions of weeds with cover crops really had a prolonged legacy on the weed being realized in the cash crop part. And then so organic matter, be patient, it's going to take way longer than anything else, right? But it happens. All right, so what if, and that was, the whole idea was based on the premise of research from Utah State. What if we actually apply an exorbitant amount of composted manure once and then follow it? So that's the part of the project that we did in Lingo. High rate means 45 tons, and then once, and not like breaking it down for like 3 subsequent sort of arrays every 3 or 4 years, and see if we actually create a system that could be stabilized by having cover crops. Would we then help conserve and extend the benefits of plant compost alone, just because by putting cover crops into the fairly fertile system on relative terms, we could grow this biomass that would prolong that effectiveness of this compost and maybe modify it and transition into some or other ecosystem service that we're not even aware of. Okay. If yes, what benefits would that be? How would that impact crop performance or even biomass performance? And whether or not we will be able to retain soil nutrients, retain nitrogen in some sort of a capacity that would carry on longer than anything else. Okay. So here is what we had. We cross-compared control low, medium, high rates against the fertilizer. We were stating sort of a high rate that would be comparable somehow to the fertilizer, inorganic fertilizer. And then obviously we assumed that about 11, it's kind of on a low range, obviously, percent of that nitrogen will be available from compost in the first year, but it's a very comparable thing. And I would say it's even lower when it comes to lingo. Okay. Soils, boy, you know your soils. They are fun to work with because probably you'll see the results pretty fast if you can work with them, but you can see that those are certain loans. These are the properties of the compost. These are the properties of soil. Yeah, the total carbon, total nitrogen obviously are very low. So first question we had was that wet wheat density. Now, this is actually over a year of the full fallow that was planted with the cover crops and how it affected in the fallow phase, in a wheat phase, I'm sorry. So that legacy of cover crops similar to the paper I was relating to, whether or not there were any difference. So the blue bars are cover crops and then the white bars are no cover crops the year before, right? And if we look at the wheat density, we have, quite an impressive decline, especially when we're dealing with the lower rates of this application and then with the organic fertilizer. And here, sort of a gray zone again. We don't know what to make of it. Maybe they were equally competitive because there was a lot of good nitrogen, right, in the fallow phase. But also this legacy carried the next season when we were following the soil, which was really interesting. And you could even see this different and consistently reduced amounts of weeds in the fallow phase when we had cover crops. And this was 2 years later.
This is after the cover crops.
Yes, so cover crops were in 2016 in the fallow phase.
And this data was 17 and 18.
And this is 17 and 18. Yeah.
Could you go through the timing of when the wheat was planted, when it came up, when you planted cover crop?
Okay, yeah. So cover crop was planted in the fallow in the spring of 2016, terminated after 60 days. And then in the fall, October of 2016, we planted winter wheat. And that was, the wheat phase was, we analyzed that in July of the weeds. Okay. And then, so again, that went into a fallow. And we have it here with and without cover crops. So cover crops were taken out. Okay. So now, here's an example of the fallow phase with cover crops, without. This is mainly oats, maybe 3 Austrian winter peas here growing through, but you could clearly see that there's an effect of smothering that we could believe that would be attributed to some form of a change of competitive traits of wheat that we always hate, right? Yeah. So another thing that we did was we looked at not necessarily the biomass, but we also looked at the diversity of weeds. And we looked at what we call a Shannon diversity index. And we, again, cover crops in 2017 had consistently reduced number of weeds or number of different kinds of weeds in the field compared to non-cover crops. Yeah.
Why did you terminate after 60 days?
Moisture.
I think we were concerned about the moisture. It was a kind of a dry year, and they looked like they were starting flowering. Okay. Yeah. So another thing that we've covered and we've explored even with my students in the class is the potential performance of individual species and the rhizosphere effect on neighborhood species. And there is some strong evidence showing that allelopathy, which is form of a root exudation in the rhizosphere of specific species that targets and makes sort of an environment of other weeds or other species inhabitable. Whether it's through the suppression, water exploitation, microbial kill, I don't know, there's different traits. But we've noticed that if there are different sources of this allelopathy that can be either, again, root residues, root exudate, plant extracts of residues. And I actually put some, and I forgot to fill up the gaps here, but oats and winter wheat I was looking at it, but it looks like pigweed can be actually targeted, mustards with pennycress, cheatgrass. There's probably more information about it. This is just what I was sort of looking at. Unfortunately, our usual culprits are not going to be addressed. So kosher is here to stay, right? And Russian, so I tried to find something, but boy, maybe neighbors. So if you see this is the longer sort of a legacy effect that we see. If we plant wheat to cover crops and obviously high rates of compost, I only see here this really nice greenhouse here. It's a perfectly randomized block design, by the way. You can see the differences in the green in this really highest rate of compost, but we didn't really see that visually yet, all these benefits that can be accrued over time with these cover crops. But yet, when we were regressing the yield against this nitrogen rate or rate of compost here, we saw that there is actually a separation going on with more of a yield response coming from a combination of that high rate of compost or regular rate of special here and the cover crops. Okay, so there was something that was happening that probably were too fast to jump to the conclusions, but there's some tendencies that we noticed, right? So again, suppress wheat, yes. Reduce soil water content. Say yes.
Yes.
Well, but if we're dealing with this 11 inches of precipitation, it doesn't matter, right? Winter wheat establishment, reduce winter wheat yield. There are some tendencies again. I like to think about positive sides of it. So is there something that we can accrue that when we retire and our kids will be farmers, maybe they'll benefit from what we're doing right now, right? It's just not going to happen overnight, right? So how would you design cover crop treatment for this region? And we have representatives from Slaterbank, probably Sydney, and maybe Alvin. Do you think that you would throw something out there and design, decorate your farm? I know that there will be a panel later, but maybe we can relate to this and discuss it. So one thing that I said I'm going to bring it up from the whole idea of a mode of acquisition, curious sort of a graph that if you remember, we had that nitrogen uptake from compost in the greenhouse study when we had that fresh compost sort of growing in a continuous cover crops in the 3 years after that under control. And we looked at what's called the signature of delta M15 signature of leguminous plants. And the more negative, the lower the value it is. That means the legume is on its own and fixed nitrogen. The more positive the value is, even way smaller than the other, that means it's actually acquiring nitrogen or scavenging nitrogen from other sources than atmospheric and, but rather, so it becomes, as we sometimes refer to, kind of a lazy legume, okay? So if we add a very fresh compost, the legumes actually are maybe even competing with oats for the nitrogen from the compost, while as we wait for 3 years, and then obviously when we don't give them any nitrogen, they're on their own, right? So that might have some sort of an implication into how would you design a cover crop sequence in order to make the system effective. Would you wait for a few years and not plant legumes for a while in some systems like we have, and then maybe allow perhaps some sort of a green up and a green biomass to utilize this compost, and then sort of put legume out years later, or something else? And I have no idea. This is just something to throw out. Conclusions. So we think that obviously the cover crops can smother weeds. And they obviously, you know, in so many ways you can think about it, both cover crops and the biomass can prolong the effect of weed phase following the fallow. And annual cover crop planting and your corporation may be able to build up organic matter following the legacy of that high grade of compost. So it may be a valuable alternative, but it's sort of a really intensely managed and sort of a smart way of thinking about it. You know, you have to almost go to the farm and like you're watering your carrots, you have to think about it, whether or not you should terminate it, whether you should add more crops, what kind of the benefits it have, and whether or not things can grow if you have, let's say, 10 different seeds in a mixture of different kinds. Will they all germinate? No, conditions, right? Are we going to really get those benefits? So, and can we or will we do something to not to compromise the wheat yield, which is already low? So one of the things that we tried and we were sort of proud of, are you guys familiar with this called Facilia? What do you think about it?
It's an excellent pollinator plant.
Right, but can you before you terminate, before it actually flowers, can you terminate it for effective biomass? Does it sort of in this point like bush up or?
Usually it's a minor factor in what we put together. Usually there's sorghums and other things growing that sun limited to a degree. So but I don't know that we've ever had problems with it affecting the falling crop.
Okay.
We did Grocery and Sheridan as part of the mix, grading mix. Rick created a group on it. I
Okay.
was concerned about becoming a weed, started kind of.
So terminating before it flowers.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, okay. So again, maybe staggering up planting a legume into the system and sort of pushing it into like, you know, you fix your own thing rather than you eat mine, sort of a thing. Could be if the water is limiting, could we sort of try to promote instead of doing it in every row, but do the skip row, so plant every other row cover crops and see if they could green up and not effectively, you know, draw down the whole soil profile. And one thing also it's really interesting that in the low-end soils, a lot of nitrogen fixing plants don't fix nitrogen because it takes energy, as you heard from the first sort of a presentation today, but rather they allocate a carbon to the roots to scavenge out and look for that nitrogen. Now, question is it a trade of the root itself, or is it energy put out by the roots to engage in mycorrhizing? So maybe having some form of mycorrhiza enhancer, and I know that green cover works toward building those mixes, and then maybe we add a little bit of biochar, and then we'll go full circle and it's all right to good. Maybe those little sort of a smart ways of out-competing or outsmarting the system could be effective. But again, it's a sort of a very big thinking tank sort of thing. I'd like to acknowledge all sorts of people, tremendous amount of work. Majority of people are the ones that would go to the field the whole year. We had other components of the project built in that includes basic modeling, trace definition, a variety of other parameters. Got funding from 3 sources, including Wyoming Department of Agroecology, University, and the National Funding Competition. And if you have any questions, if I can answer, I will, but if not, I'm going to refer them to everybody else. Oh yeah. I usually make students do the guesses of what they said or happened, but this time I'm going to let it out. All right, yeah, I had a question.
I just have 2 wonders. Have you ever considered trying to do a fall cover crop, even though Acres claims it didn't work? But would you ever be willing to try and then winter kill. And then also, question 1, question 2, having a 2-species cover crop is great. You know, you're looking at just peas, but there's so many other legumes out there that have so many beneficials that I've used in some of my mixes with my Dryland guys that they actually don't use peas. Have you ever considered going maybe a little more multi-species, just again, to try to test spots?
Excellent points. And yes, as a follow-up, yes and yes. So we actually did planted a lot of things, 5 different mixtures, I believe, last fall in my carpet tunnel legacy collection bag, and they were all mixes of at least 20 different species. So we had a lot of things, but probably not all of them will come out. But they look good. But yeah, everything.
We're waiting indeed.
Yes, we will.
So you mean to leave those in there all winter?
Say it again.
You mean to leave the cover crop in there all winter?
So well, I'll have a lot of my people plant them for and this is just my area. August 1st, I want them in. August 15th deadline, and then they winter kill. But it's just
we were not there. We were on vacation on August 1st. Yeah, we'll see what survives and sort of play with it a little bit and see if we can.
What's your area?
I was in Akron when I did it for some of them, and then now I'm in right in Weld County, Adams, so eastern Washington or eastern Colorado.
Thank you.
My question is, could we, a way to try to utilize, I mean, around here you plant something, you have cash flow and figure out how to do it. When you talk about terminating, is there any way you could use like intensive grazing of cattle or something to actually terminate and make a profit of actually feeding your cattle? Is there a way to utilize that into the mixture of stuff?
I think so. I mean, I think Jay's doing a little bit of research, and I see some nodding heads out here too. As long as they don't go into the wheat phase out there, I would not see the reason why not. I think that would, obviously we would have a lot of additional nitrogen credits from the animal inputs. And if the lightning strikes, we'll get even more. So just to say, I think absolutely. That's a very, especially
Yeah, I
if you
think
have
that's
sort of
kind of a hot topic, livestock. In fact, in our planning meeting, we want to really
so
focus
next
on
year
this in
we're
the
planning
future.
on having
But livestock integration to utilize a cover crop, right? So some people argue it's not a cover crop if livestock eat it. But there's some research that maybe you showed that no you didn't, but livestock in the mix doesn't negate the benefits of cover crops, but it kind of speeds up the cycle. So you get it speeds up nutrient cycle.
Let the livestock graze the top half, which is the nutritious half, and let the bottom half remain recovered to protect the soil.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yes.
Sorry. I always can come up with a question.
I know.
So at the beginning of your talk, you were talking about the importance of microorganisms. I'm wondering have you looked at like microbial community structure or function in those systems? Because it seems like there might be a lot going on there that we just simply don't know about.
So the answer is I personally have not. But I know that Buzariba out back, he looked at the mycorrhizal association in the systems. And I know that there's one of the soil ecologists here on campus that is doing it. This data I pulled out is from the literature that showed it, that actually the functionality and diversity of microbes do occur as you add more complexity into your rotations. And the cover crops per se are adding that too, especially because you're terminating it and not removing that residue out or crop out of the field. So
We're looking at microbial biomass, carbon and nitrogen, not the PLFA.
For information sharing for you, Jim, Dr. Christine Jones from Australia, she comes out to Eastern Colorado a lot. She's got one, I just saw her last week, but not that she would know all, but she just studies a lot specifically on what you just asked. She's got paper after paper after paper of her studies.
all right.
One of them is called liquid carbon pathway,
Yeah.
which is talking about root
She
exudation.
likes to come out to Julesburg area a lot. Work is being covered.
Did she get a PhD at Wyoming? Is that the person I can't remember?
No, she got her PhD in Australia, but she just got a lot of she just studies that.
Are any of these cover crops that you use adapted varieties to the northern high plains? Or are you taking stuff from the Atlantic and Montana and Iowa and everywhere else?
So this mixtures were designed for low moisture conditions for dryland by green cover out in Nebraska. So they're the ones that are putting the mixes together. You just tell them how much precipitation you have, what is the length of the growing day, what are your goals? And they're like early spring or late fall and whatnot. So I would refer your questions directly to them.
Where in Nebraska?
Well, green covers in Hastings, but they're
Bladen's just south of Hastings. Yeah.
Bladen. They're I mean, they source from all over, so I'm not sure where these seeds are coming from.
I think you're asking about
what
microtypes.
ecotypes they might be.
Well, you have wheat varieties that do well in northeast Colorado. That is not the same that does well in Montana.
Well, the oats were, you planted a bunch of them, but our oats that we use as cover crop were the organic oats from the farmers we were working with.
Yeah, and we probably will do a lot of testing after we plant and see what comes out. Because we know what we're putting into the ground and see what kind of diversity of cover crops and contributions of different species to the mix we'll have. Standing green and how they perform. So that's sort of a project.
So Laytonville is a little bit lower elevation than most of southeast Wyoming. Have you seen any effects? Akron is 5,000 feet. What, Laytonville's 4,000, something like that. Have you seen any effects of elevation?
I have not looked at it. We did only oats and Eastern winter pea at different locations so far. So this is sort of a new thing that we're doing. Yeah.
I'm interested in no-till systems, and I was wondering if you had ever run across any difference in like microbial communities or soil structure for cover crops used on no-till systems, as opposed to the systems we use under.
I've looked at the no-till as a sort of a standalone feature, and there is an increased amount of microbial biomass in general in the systems, and I know that we're thinking about doing that skip row, and if that happens, we will have some sort of a special stratification of no-till versus till after we harvest the legumes, and I can answer this question later, but you generally, my student did some modeling on days and on no-till. It takes about 12 years of a no-till to return to organic matter to the free disturbance phase. And that usually comes from the fact there's less soil carbon emissions and better management of nitrogen, better retention to less nitrous oxide as well. So, but if you put cover crops, we could sort of think about how to manage it because you have to terminate it. And if you think about just mowing it or grazing it off, I think that would be very beneficial. Absolutely.
So some people use roller crippers. If you get the right physiological stage of the cover crop, they can be effective terminating.
Yeah.
We had a talk from by Pat Carr, who's now in Montana, and it was probably 2 years ago, about organic no-till. And they were just pushing those systems as far as they could. How many years can we get by with, or how many years can we live with the weeds before the weeds become uneconomical, basically? And it's not, I assume you're talking about organic. It's not it's not something farmers are going to do yet, from what they found. And using every other kind of weed control they could besides tillage. How long could they make that last? That was just at CSU. Did you talk about that research?
Yeah, I know they have a new project looking at
Perennial weeds.
Yeah.
Okay.
Where they're doing a lot with just competition?
They did, I think cover crops and competition was one of their timings, crimping, grazing, vinegar, everything else they could do besides tillage to see how long they could stretch it out. And it was like maybe 3 years before, 2 to 3 before weeds were just too.
In the organic system, you really have to build in a window of tillage at the prime time to get rid of your worst crops, worst weed crops, and still be ready to plant 5 days later so that you cover the ground back. The evaporation is the elephant in the room. If that first cover crop can produce enough durable cover to keep the ground covered until the following crop makes canopy closure, you reduce evaporation by about 50%.
All right, well, thank you very much.